This talk is about communications in distributed teams. And you might be wondering, why am I talking about that? Or rather, why am I talking about that? So I have to admit that at this stage, I'm getting to the age where when I go to a conference, I tend to raise the age average rather than lower it with my presence. So I turned 40 this year. I've been in IT for, oh, thank you. I've been in IT for about 19 years now, out of which 18 were full-time. And out of that, I've worked in 4 successive companies, all of which worked out of offices for 11 years. Then I founded and ran a completely distributed company for 6 years. And now for a little over 2 years, I've been running a distributed team that is a business unit of a company that has existed for 15 years, and throughout that time has only ever worked from a single office. So that's all sort of interesting things, and I think I might have seen and I have been made aware of some of the rather interesting challenges that come with this. But I would like to state one thing up front. This isn't science. Nothing of what I'm talking about is steeped in any kind of scientific rigor. I present anecdotes rather than evidence. I might be mistaking correlation for causation or the other way around. Everything that I'm talking about is solely based on my personal experience and the experience of others that I have talked to or watched or read. And everything that I say here, okay, this is in Israel, so this is obvious. Everything that I say here is subject to debate and rebuttal. Or you can simply have a different opinion, that's cool too, but it's definitely not science. Now, with all of that said, let me attempt to give a definition of a distributed team according to my own understanding. A distributed team is a professional group whose members do not rely on physical proximity in order to routinely collaborate productively. Now, I understand that this is clearly not an ideal definition, not least because it defines something by a negative and also an outside factor. It basically defines a distributed team by what it does not need in order to exist and to function, but it's the best definition I've been able to come up with. And I do want to highlight there's 2 key words in there. The first one is professional. I'm talking about teams that work toward a professional goal, which doesn't necessarily mean that they all work for the same company. They could be working in different companies, but collaborating on a joint project. That is what frequently happens in open source software projects. But the important thing is they're not doing their hobby or pursuing their hobby, they're doing their job. And the second one that's important is routinely. I'm talking about teams that habitually work in a distributed fashion, and I'm not talking about the work that goes on in, say, an office-based team when just one person is having their occasional work from home day. And it's important to understand that this lack of proximity that I'm talking about here is not only related to where people are, it's not only spatial, it's temporal as well, because working in a team that is distributed means working asynchronously. This is equivalent. If your team is distributed, it's equivalent to saying that it works in asynchronous fashion, which is to say people will work on things in parallel, and a capable distributed team will have just as few synchronization points as absolutely necessary. And the reason for this is not just that you might be working in different time zones, which may very well be true, but also the fact that everyone on the team is going to have their own daily routine. They're going to have individual times when they are most productive. And if you run a team like that, you will not attempt to synchronize those, because doing so would mean setting the entire team up for failure. Now, it's important to acknowledge and understand that this doesn't come for free and it doesn't fall in our lap, because people aren't born with the ability to work in a distributed team. Humans function best in groups that collaborate in close proximity to one another. That's what's been working for us for 2 million years. And it's only very recently that technology has started to enable us to override that to a certain extent, which gives us other benefits, like we can work from home. Companies have the benefit that we can hire people who are residing pretty much anywhere, just as long as they have internet connectivity. And that means that we now can work in teams despite being potentially continental or planetary distances away from each other, but we do have to acquire the skills to do that. And if we fail to do so, that has a rather grave disadvantage. And the advantage is that absolutely nothing has as dire an impact on productivity as poor communications. I realize this is a truism. This applies to both distributed and non-distributed teams. If you have bad communications, that's a surefire way to wreck any project, blow any budget, fail any objective. Note, importantly, the reverse isn't true. So having good communications does not guarantee success. But bad communications does guarantee failure. And here's one thing to start with in a distributed team. A capable distributed team habitually externalizes information. Information is generally far less useful when it's only stored in one person's head, as opposed to being accessible in a shared system that everyone can use and trusts. And if you take important information out of your own head and you store it in a medium that allows others to easily find and also contextualize it, that I think is a pretty obvious win for everyone. And we're all tech people, so we typically have multiple facilities to do this, multiple facilities to externalize and share and access information at our disposal. So let's see how those compare. A distributed team will habitually use multiple modes of communication, and it will rely mostly on those that make sharing, finding, and very importantly, contextualizing information easy, and it will avoid those that make it difficult. And I want to say that in many teams, whether they're distributed or not, using chat as a default mode of communication is kind of becoming the norm. And I want to say that with an important exception that I'm going to get to at near the end of the talk, this using chat excessively is not a symptom of having a particularly dynamic or efficient team. I posit it's rather the opposite. It's a symptom of a particularly bad kind of laziness. Note, I say laziness, not malice. I'm not insinuating that people are doing this to just spite you. But it's a bad kind of laziness. It's an attempt to communicate quickly and easily for yourself, while in reality you're making things harder for everyone, including yourself. And that's not great. Because while sharing information in a chat is very easy, it's also a fire and forget mode of communication. Chat makes it very difficult to find and contextualize information after the fact. If you've ever attempted to scour a busy, say, Slack archive for a discussion on a specific topic that you only remember to have happened a few months ago or a few weeks ago, you're probably with me on this one. It's exceedingly difficult to read a Slack discussion in context, that is to say, to put it in relation to other discussions on the same topic, which may have happened days or weeks earlier or later. So you're going to have to imagine a smiley face for chat share and a frowny face for chat contextualize. Okay, I hope this is fine on your phones or on your laptops if you're following along. So chat, good for sharing, mediocre for finding things, really terrible for contextualizing information. Email makes it easy to share information with a person or group from the get-go, but it makes it quite difficult to loop people into an ongoing discussion after the fact. So email is basically mediocre for all of those. Finding information in email is just as hard as with a chat, and it's marginally better, but not by much, at contextualizing information because you do get proper threading. A wiki and an issue tracker, in contrast, both make it very easy to share, find, and contextualize information. So the wiki and the issue tracker in the original actually have smiley faces everywhere. And I should perhaps mention that a wiki in this context is just a shorthand for any facility that allows you to collaboratively edit long-form documents online. That can be an actual wiki like a media wiki, but it can also be something like Confluence. Brian in his keynote mentioned shared Google Docs, all of that. Collaboratively edit long-form documents online. Likewise, an issue tracker can mean request tracker, OTRS, Jira, Taiga, Bugzilla, whatever works. Video calls are, you can share information reasonably well, but it doesn't scale at all. You can't reasonably have more than 5 or so people in a video call, and sharing the recording, the unedited recording of a full video call is just pointless because nobody ever watches that. So really what you want to do is you want to make your wiki and your issue tracker your default mode of communications, and then use the other ones sparingly. This isn't meant to be shorthand for don't use them, as I'm going to get to in a second. But basically, defaulting to something like a collaborative wiki and an issue tracker as your primary mode of communications in a distributed asynchronous team generally tends to be a good idea. So let's talk about text chat briefly. And I put text chat up there principally because usually today that frequently means Slack, but what I'm talking about is not limited to Slack. It also applies to IRC, Mattermost, Riot, whatever you choose to use. Is text chat universally useful? Nope. Is it universally bad? Not that either, because there's a very specific type of situation in which text chat is a very good thing. You want to use interactive chat for the kind of communication that requires immediate and interactive mutual feedback from two or more participants. That's not the case. Chat tends to not be a good idea. What that means is that the only thing that chat is actually good for is communication that is required to be synchronous. And in a distributed team, asynchronicity is the norm. So that's why using interactive chat for communications needs to be an exceptional event for a distributed team, because if it's instead a regular occurrence, you're actually trying to synchronize a distributed team and take away its key advantage. And that's quite likely to make everyone on the team miserable. For any interaction that does not require feedback that is both interactive and immediate, you're usually far better off with an email, a wiki, a shared wiki page, or a comment on an issue tracker. Direct messages, that is to say, chat messages that you don't send over a shared channel, they're useful precisely when one clearly delineated confluence of events occurs, which is you want immediate feedback from the other person, you need mutual back and forth with the other person, and you don't want others to follow the conversation. It's obvious that this combination is perfectly valid. You may have these situations. You want to chat or talk about something interactively with a colleague and you want it to be confidential. That's fine, but it should be exceedingly rare. If you just want a private exchange of ideas with someone, then encrypted email will be fine. If you want to work on something together with one person before you share it with others, then having restricted view permissions initially on a wiki page or issue tracker ticket will work just fine, and so on. I posit that if you don't need confidentiality, but you do need interactive and immediate feedback. So basically, you're talking about something and you want to talk with just one person, but not because it's inherently confidential, it is really likely that eventually you're going to want to pull other opinions and bring other people into the conversation than you won't. So that means you can just use a shared channel from the get-go, because that way it's far easier for others to follow the conversation if they choose to, and they might be able to point out, say, an incorrect assumption that one of you has before you all end up chasing a red herring, which would be a bad thing. Pinging someone in a chat is exactly like walking up to a person, interrupting what they're doing, tapping them on the shoulder and asking them a question. And it doesn't matter whether it's your intention or not, they will feel compelled to answer relatively promptly. The only exception is when you've done this so often that you've conditioned your colleagues to ignore you. If that's the case, then congratulations, you have a different problem. But it means that ping means you're potentially breaking their train of thought, yank them out of a potentially complex task, force them to redo what they did pre-interruption. They might actually commit a mistake. So pinging someone in a chat is something that you should only do if you're aware of this risk and you're convinced that whatever you're pinging about is more important, which might totally happen, but don't make it the default. If you absolutely want people to despise you, send them naked pings. A naked ping is the action of sending someone a message consisting just of their username and something like ping, hi, hey, or something like that. Any person who is versed in the use of chat communications will, when subjected to this behavior, be inclined to flay you alive. Infinitely more so if it's a DM. Just don't do this. Please don't. Instead, what you want to do is you always want to provide context. Always, always, always. Don't say, hey, can I ask you a question? Instead, ask the frickin' question. If something isn't urgent, you can add a marker like no urgency or something like that. You should, or, you just provide context like in this example. I hope it is self-evident why this is better than using naked pings. But if for some reason to you or your boss or your manager it's not, then please have them read Naked Pings, which is on the GNOME blog. If you Google Naked Pings GNOME, you'll find a wonderful article that's by Alan Jackson and Mark McLaughlin called Naked Pings, which explains why this is a terrible idea. I'd like next to talk about video calls, and really doesn't matter what technology we're talking about here. It could be Zoom, Google Hangouts, BlueJeans, Jitsi, whatever. There is a very good reason to use video calls, which is they give you the ability to pick up on non-textual and non-verbal cues from the call participants, which is great, but you should be aware that that's really the only good reason to use them. Video calls do have a significant drawback, which is that until technology progresses to the point that we get reliable automatic speech recognition and transcription, they're really only half on the record, because hardly anyone goes to the trouble of preparing a full transcript for the meeting, and if anything, what you'll perhaps get is a summary of the points that were discussed and the decisions that were made or the action items agreed to and so forth. So even if we keep recordings of all of our video calls, it's practically impossible to discern after the fact what was discussed in the meeting before actual decisions were made. And it's also practically impossible to find a specific discussion point where you only have like a vague recollection of when it was discussed in the video call. Whereas if you having the discussion in any kind of text-based medium, you stand a much better chance of actually finding that discussion point. Every video call needs an agenda. That is, of course, true for any meeting, not just those conducted by a video call. And every video call needs meeting notes. You need notes and a summary of every meeting that you attend, and you do need to circulate them. If you think that a video call is in any way less work than the other modes of communication, that's only when everyone's lazy and the call is therefore useless. So really, every meeting needs notes and a summary, and you need to circulate these notes not only with everyone who attended the meeting or the call, but with everyone who has a need to know. And you can follow a format here. This is just a suggestion, but it's one that works well for me and my team, where that summary looks like this. We state basically the title or the purpose of the meeting, when it happened, who attended, a quick summary, then the discussion points, and finally the action items that were agreed to. The summary has a specific function. This should be basically an executive summary, and you put it at the very top for a reason. Because what that means is you're now circulating the meeting notes to the people that have some sort of a need to know. And when they have a summary at the top, then that enables them to quickly decide whether they should A, familiarize themselves immediately with what was discussed and then potentially respond if they have objections. B, they might only need to be aware of what was decided because that impacts them. Or C, they might just want to keep in the back of their heads that, okay, we had a meeting about this and there's notes about the meeting and this is where I can find them when I need to refer back to them. So that's a simple format for meeting notes, which will usually cover all the bases. I think that for recurring team meetings, provided they don't happen too often, using video calls is a perfectly good opportunity to feel the pulse of your team. A distributed team has generally few meetings because there are synchronization points, and we've already discussed that we strive to minimize those for the distributed team to be effective, which, by the way, means that the idea of having daily stand-ups and sprint planning meetings every week and sprint retrospectives every week, that's actually fundamentally incompatible with distributed teams. In my humble opinion, it's also why using Scrum is a terrible idea in distributed teams. It's also why using Scrum is a terrible idea, period, but that's a different story. I have done a rant on this on that stage over there, and it's up on YouTube if you want to. Don't be a Scrum bag. Yeah, don't be a Scrum bag, exactly, thank you. However, having one meeting a week perhaps, or maybe even one every 2 weeks in a video call. That is useful precisely for the reason I mentioned before, which is you can pick up on nonverbal cues like body language and posture, facial expressions, tone. If people are stressed out or they're generally unhappy, it'll show. If they're relaxed and productive, that will show too. So for that purpose, video calls are actually a pretty useful tool. I want to talk about briefing people, briefing a group of people on an important matter. And I want to propose to you to use a 5-paragraph format for this. Now, interestingly enough, this is something that comes out of the military, and I believe this is actually a format that the IDF does not teach. So this might be new even for the many of you who have served. This is actually something that comes out of NATO. In NATO parlance, this is called the 5-paragraph field order. And the 5 prescribed paragraphs are the situation, what's our mission, what's the execution, how are we going to achieve and accomplish the mission, what's the logistics, and command and signal is basically how are we going to communicate. I want to state up front that, despite the fact that I have served and I'm a reserve officer, I'm generally not a fan of applying military thinking to civilian life, because if we're being honest, it's an organization that's optimized for killing people and breaking things. But in this case, this specific case is actually something that can be very much applied to professional communications in business with some rather minor modifications. This is the format that I use when I need to brief my team when we embark on a new project or start working with a new technology or something like that. Situation, that's the position that we're in, and the why we set out to do what we want to do. Objective is what we want to achieve. Our plan is how we want to achieve it. Logistics is about the budget that we have available, the resources that we have available, and how we intend to use them. And communications is about how we're going to be coordinating amongst ourselves and also with others in order to achieve our goal. And this just gives me a nice little way of keeping track of, okay, did I actually cover all my bases? Did I include everything that I need to include in order to brief my team or even people in other teams? When you do this, people have always questions about what they've just been briefed about. Your briefing will never be perfect. But they might not think of those questions straight away. So you want to give your people time to think through what you've just briefed them on, and then they will definitely think of good questions. So you always want to have a follow-up round at a later time. That could be 2 hours later or the following day or whatever. And in that, you want to encourage your group to come back with questions. So actually asking them to be available for another round of questions or come back to you by email with questions is much better than to just ask, are there any questions? Because the knee-jerk response to that is, no, it's all good. And you can also use that follow-up for a different purpose. You can actually check for how your briefing came across. You can gently sort of quiz people. You can ask questions like, okay, by what date do we want to implement feature X? Or Joe, what things are you going to need to coordinate with Jane on? That sort of thing. Because that also gives you feedback on the quality of your briefing. Because if your team can't answer these questions, then chances are you weren't as clear as you should have been, and then you can improve at a later date. I want to say a few words about what I like to call pinching the fire hose that you might otherwise be forced to drink from. When you work in a distributed team, because everyone is on their own schedule and everything is asynchronous, you may be dealing with a constant incoming stream of information, which can come from your colleagues, can come from your reports, can come from your manager, can come from your customer. There isn't any way to change this. You cannot actually reduce that information flow, but what you can do and need to do is apply your own structure to that stream. And what follows, what I'm going to talk about next, is not the way to do it, but a way to do it, and you might find another one that works better for you. But I will say this, you're going to need to define and apply some structure, because otherwise you're going to just feel constantly overwhelmed and you're at a serious risk of burnout. And the defined approach that I'm talking about is something that I personally learned from David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. It's called the 4D approach. I don't know if David Allen actually invented that approach or whether someone came up with it before him, but that's how I know about it. And he proposes 4 actions that you can apply to any bit of incoming information. Drop means, is this stuff that you need to read, understand, and then archive. That's what you use for anything that doesn't require action on your part. You still need to understand, but you don't need to do anything other than that. Delegate is for things that do require action, but not from you, which means you want to make sure that it gets to the right person and it's understood by that person, and you make a note for follow-up. Defer means it needs doing, and it's also you who needs to do it, but it doesn't need doing immediately. So you want to enter that into your task list and clear that from your inbox, and you're going to loop back to it later. And do are the things, and those are typically very few, that remain after you've done all the other filtering. And those are the ones that need to be done, and they need to be done by you, and they need to be done immediately. And that's a very helpful approach. It doesn't mean that you'll never be overwhelmed by the amount of information that you need to process, but it will greatly reduce that risk of overwhelm. And there's a few interesting rules for these. Dropping things, that doesn't mean ignoring them. You'll still have to read them and understand what's in them, and you're going to be able to find them later, which means you never delete things, except spam. You can throw that away. But generally, you only archive, you never delete. You archive them in a way that keeps them retrievable in the future. And if there's something that isn't understandable to you, you want to think it through, pull in additional documentation, look or ask for clarification. Rules for delegation. Delegation obviously requires that there is a person that you can delegate to, which isn't necessarily someone who reports to you. It might be someone you report to. You might, for example, you might be asked to deal with something that in reality you have no control over, but your manager does, in which case you're going to need to delegate upward. And the rules for delegation are you want to find the right person that can actually get this task done. You want to preemptively send them all the information that you think they might need and that you have access to, rather than engaging in a back and forth of them always asking for more additional information. Like everything that you've got and that you think might be important for them in their context, just send it to them. Ask them to acknowledge that they have received what they needed. And then you want to make a note to follow up to see, number one, to see if they need anything else, and also follow through by seeing the task to completion. And I want to re-emphasize here, this should sort of go without saying, but I want to emphasize that if you're delegating within your own team, you only ever delegate tasks and not responsibility. Like outward and upward, it's always you who remains responsible. I want to say one thing. You really shouldn't delegate or not even define any tasks that you're not prepared to follow through on. So let me give you an example. If you just handwave everyone using encrypted email from now on, and you're not prepared to make that work for your own email account, then you might as well just leave it, right? That's a useless thing to define and do if you're not prepared to follow up. But if you do proclaim a rule or an objective or whatever, and then you find yourself unable to see it through, which happens, and I maintain that's no sign of ineptitude or failure, you want to loudly and clearly rescind that pronouncement, right? It's far better for you to visibly backtrack on something rather than be perceived as someone whose statements are basically safe to ignore, right? Because there's not going to be any follow-up anyway. Deferring simply means that because something you need to do doesn't need doing immediately, you can do it at a time that suits your schedule. So that means that you'll need to add the task immediately to some sort of queue. For email, I use a folder that's simply named needs reply. Actually, I have two. I have needs reply and I have needs follow-up. If you're on a Gmail basis, then you can do this much nicer with labels and things, but whichever. You then want to make sure that at some later time you go through that queue to prioritize. That would ideally be right after you're done with the do tasks, which we're going to get to in a moment. And you absolutely want to ensure that you make time to go back and actually do those prioritized tasks at any time that you consider convenient. And finally, there's the do tasks. So basically, that's stuff that I need to do and do immediately, which is I want to tell people that I'm doing them because I want to be uninterrupted. I generally want no interruptions. I want to turn off all my notifications and whatnot. And then I actually want to plow through all the undropped, undelegated, undeferred items until I'm actually through. Now, the entirety of the talk up to this point has focused on professional communications, right? And among people who are unfamiliar or unexperienced with work in a distributed team, it's often accepted that teams can communicate well professionally, but then people frequently ask, okay, what about the water cooler talks? What about the informal discussions that happen while people are, chatting over coffee? Well, firstly, many people who ask that come out of a company where information exchange hinges on cafeteria talk simply because they don't give a damn about externalizing information. And if 90% of your company's knowledge is only in people's heads, then you're dead without the cafeteria, pretty much. But if the same thing never happens in a distributed team, it really never gets off the ground. So if you do have a team that's functional and productive, because it habitually externalizes information, then the absence of chit-chat over coffee really has zero negative impact on information flow. But you also may be interested in the non-work related talk that happens over coffee, the stuff that simply contributes to people's relaxation and well-being and whatnot. I hate to break this to you. I know this might shock some people, but there's plenty of people out there who can make an absolutely terrific contribution to your company who just happen to dislike the social aspect of work. They tend to be called introverts. They might thrive when they're being left alone. They might like having as little small talk as possible. They might relish the opportunity that they have to socialize with their friends and family, but just not with work. And that's cool. But even so, if you do have people that enjoy having an entirely informal conversation every once in a while, there totally is room for that in a distributed team. All it takes is a specific keyword that you agree on for a chat. It could be something like this, coffee break. Okay? So basically, what that means is I'm on a break and I'm happy to chat with anyone who's inclined, preferably about non-work related things. If that's what your group agrees on, that's perfectly cool, right? You could even have a dedicated channel for this. You name it, whatever, random internal or something like that, right? Where people can just converse and talk about whatever, right? So you can totally do that. All right, as I'm about to run out of time, I do want to mention one thing very briefly, and you're welcome to see me after about this or review the slides online, which is I want to acknowledge there is a complete antithesis to what I've just been talking about, and Robert is sitting back there who's written extensively about the topic, which is ChatOps. Okay, so which is a completely distributed and a completely alternative framework for distributed teams, which, as far as I know, this is something that was coined in about 2013. Jesse Newland from GitHub did a talk at Ruby Fuse about that at that time, so that's kind of the earliest mention that I've seen of that. And in a distributed team, if it operates on a ChatOps basis, absolutely everything happens in a chat. Everything happens in an interactive text communication mode. And what you do is in such a system that you rely heavily on the use of chatbots. So for example, if an alert lands in the channel, the discussion then yields that the proper fix for the problem is to run a specific Ansible playbook. You actually send an in-chat bot command that kicks off that playbook and reports the result, which is laudable because it resolves a major issue with using chat, which is the scenario of something being discussed and then someone going away for a bit and then coming back saying, hey, I fixed it, and everyone's happy, but no one's actually learned from it, right? And if you make everything explicit in band that way, then it becomes easy, at least in principle, to go back to a previously solved problem that subsequently reappears and then basically replay the resolution. So can this make sense? Yes, absolutely, definitely. Under what circumstances? I'd say this is best suited for when your work tends to be inherently linear with respect to some dimension. And for example, if your primary job is to keep a system operational versus the linear passage of time, I think ChatOps can actually be an excellent approach. But keeping complex systems operational over time is the definition of ops. Okay, so I think it's a very, very suitable communication mode for operation, but it is, I personally posit it's highly unlikely to be efficient as a generic mode of communication across distributed teams, regardless of of what they're doing. And even then, I'd posit it's difficult to get right because you're going to have to curb channel sprawl and threading and other things, but that's a whole nother talk and probably a talk for another speaker because I don't lead an ops team. Okay, so with that, feel free to peruse this QR code to tweet about this talk and tell your friends. And office hours, yes, okay, thank you. Office hours are going to be over there somewhere. I'll be there, find me there. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the day. It's been great being here. Thanks for having me.